Good evening, and welcome again to Public Perspective. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. And as our regular viewers will know, sometimes we like to talk about the arts on this show, but what we really like to do is go behind the scenes on the arts. So tonight, we're going to go not only behind the scenes, but inside some musical instruments to see how guitars and other stringed instruments are made. Our guest tonight is Professor David Dolak from Columbia College. David, welcome to the show. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'm glad to be here.
So let me ask you just a little bit about your background. Now, you are a scientist by training and a professor at Columbia College, and one of the classes you teach is the physics of
musical instruments. Yes, I'm an environmental scientist geologist by graduate training. I worked at Argonne National Laboratory for 7.5 years, and but I've been a musician since I was 8. String instruments, violin, then guitar. My mom would let me have a guitar until I played violin for 4 years, give me some discipline. Yeah. And I apprenticed under a violin maker while I was working at Argonne, and so for 25 years I've also been building various string instruments, and eventually budget cutbacks at the lab. I wound up getting a job at Columbia to teach in the science department, and my lutherie skills, that's a string instrument builder, really I think are the thing that got me the full-time job, not to teaching the geology courses, because of course Columbia is primarily a media and arts type of school, and so I sort of developed this course called the Physics of Musical Instruments.
And as we've already seen, the stage here is actually crowded with the makings of musical instruments. So let me ask you though, still on the background, what made you decide to build your own?
I always like working with my hands. And growing up in Northwest Indiana in Hammond, right on the border of the city, there was a luthier who lived on the Illinois side in Calumet City. He was an elderly man by that point from Europe, and I would take my instruments to get worked on. In the late 80s, I was living in Washington, D.C. after grad school for a while. I had come back, and I took a guitar to get repaired, and I always liked sort of hanging around what he was doing, is I always liked working my hands and doing woodwork. And at that point, he was, David, you good man, you have good eye, you disciplined, you need to learn to do. And
okay.
I was working full time at the lab, but my evenings were pretty good. And so I have this program, you pay me this much, and over a couple of years we build the instruments, and so I became his, I guess, last and probably his most dedicated apprentice, and worked with him for a couple of years. He was about 75 at the time. And then I was sort of on my own, but the last 10 years, 11 years more of his life, his wife had then passed away. I would take him shopping, see what he was working on. So his sons are in the area here, but they were raising their families and things. I was with him a lot after that, but really a couple years that I worked with him as an apprentice to learn to build things.
That's such an old school, old world kind of practice, that an older guy took you under his wing and said, let me show you how this is done. Let me teach you the real tricks of doing this right. I mean, it's something we don't see a whole lot in today's society.
Yeah, I feel very fortunate. It's very much following a tradition. His name was Osman Tilev. He had come from Turkey. He was a colonel in the Turkish army, a career army person, and had been basically kicked out after their revolution in 1960. You got to kick the army out, and he wound up in Germany, and he had already learned how to repair violins, and he apprenticed under a German violin maker, and this was already when he was probably in his late 30s. And then he came to the United States. His sons had come here earlier and actually went to high school here. And he worked for a while in Northwest Indiana, and then visa things, he wound up having to go to Canada for a few years to finally come back to get his green card. And I never quite understood the story fully. But in Toronto, he worked with a very famous German guitar maker named Edgar Munch, and who was originally from Germany, and so that's where he learned to build the guitars. And then he came back, and he was a well-known repairman and builder in many of the shops in the Chicago area, Guitar Gallery, Wooden Music up in the city, for a number of years. And his house was in Calumet City. He did build instruments for people and took on apprentices, but I think I was probably his most dedicated and long-term apprentice. So yeah, I do feel part of a tradition, and there are some schools now that you can go to in the country. And in Chicago here, there's actually a Chicago School of Violin Making, and there's a couple guitar sort of certification schools, and I think they do nice work. I feel privileged to sort of work one-on-one with somebody who is a master.
Now, how about your class though at Columbia? Now you have that's a large, well, more than one-on-one. There are several students in the class, so relatively large. How does that work? It's a one-semester class?
Yeah, it's a one-semester class, and it's a science with a lab class. At Columbia, you have to have at least one of your science classes be considered a laboratory class. So we're doing analysis of a wide variety of musical instruments with things like oscilloscopes and spectrum analyzers to see what you hear, to sort of see the sound spectra so we can measure it, observe how the vibrations of the instrument are, are giving you the sounds and the timbres that you're hearing in the instrument. Also, we cover the mathematics of musical scales because musical scales are based on physical vibration patterns of objects. That's how we determine interval, consonant intervals, etc. And as the capstone for the course, the students will have to, they spend the last month sort of having design and build a functional instrument and then ultimately write an original song based on simple math principles and then perform it on the final day of the semester. And primarily now, I've been doing this for 16 years, the word is out. So pretty much my class is almost exclusively people from the audio or music department. So they're all musicians.
So they don't panic with this kind of idea that they have to build something to perform. They're ready for that.
The
right?
performing they're good at. I think sometimes the math, being an art school, I mean, the audio people are good with math, but some of the music people who know math is like, stay away from math. But we don't get into heavy calculus or anything, and don't need to at this level. But one of the best things about the class, besides that, yes, they're certainly going to perform, and a lot of them, of course, come in thinking that they're going to build, something like this. Well, in 4 weeks of a 15-week course, I mean, the woodworking skills, et cetera, they're not going to have. But we will build very fine things with cigar boxes. I mean, real instruments. I've seen them on YouTube, and their bands are playing them. And one of the maybe not official goals of the class, at least from the Columbia Science standpoint, is that I'm really proud that they learn to build something with their hands.
Well, and something that actually works.
Yes, but we build something with your hands because nowadays it seems like we've told an entire generation that somebody else is going to build things. We're going to be doing intellectual jobs in America, whatever that may be.
Service jobs.
Yes, and my first job after college was in the steel mills of Gary for 4 years before I went back to graduate school. So I guess I'm from an area that I'm used to having to build, things are made and manufactured. And so I think that that's a very good thing. And inevitably, when they're done, they're very proud. Some of them didn't even know how to use tools. I'm watching them use a saw the wrong way, or don't cut yourself with the chisels. And by the end, though, we work as a team, and
I bet they're very proud of it. They're happy to.
They are.
There's a sense of accomplishment from having actually built something tangible that's hard to get with other kinds of work.
I agree, and I drive them hard to make sure it'll be a quality object that will last them a number of years. So if nothing else, they'll remember the class. And again, I've seen some of them on YouTube in their bands, not just as a joke. I know a few of them have actually played parts of their instruments on their senior recitals if they built something very odd, let's say a xylophone with an odd type of temperament, something that they really couldn't purchase. So they wrote a piece for it, and then they might use it on one of their things for the senior recital. So the music department, I think, is pretty happy with what I do, and they could send their music students to get a science class that, they don't have to dissect a frog or break open rocks. Nothing against the other sciences, but yes.
Yeah, well, but it's right up the alley of the music students themselves, right? So this you have in your lap. This is an ukulele. It's something that you've constructed, right?
Yes, this is a soprano ukulele. This is sort of the smallest size in the uke family. This is made of the traditional uke wood, which is Hawaiian koa. I built this 2009. My label with the dinosaur is in there. I guess there's my geology background. It's koa wood with ebony fingerboard, and I'm not much of a uke player. Plays all right. I mean, I can play a few chords on it, but it has a French polish, which is a hand-rubbed shellac finish. I'm quite happy with it. I've sold a couple of these. To uke players, they like them, and these have become very popular in the last 5 years. 5-6 years ago at Columbia, you wouldn't have seen a uke, but on YouTube there have been a couple players, and so now ukes have become very popular.
They're very popular. In fact, in Oak Park, where the band I'm in sometimes performs, there is an ukulele club that plays there from time to time, so it's a big deal.
Anything you play in a uke just sounds happy. I don't know, it has that bouncy sound.
Well,
I
you
guess.
told me before the show that the name ukulele actually has a meaning.
It means jumping flea. I mean, it's
Which sounds kind of cheerful and upbeat. Right?
yes, and it's originally a Portuguese-derived instrument from the Portuguese navigators that first showed up on the Hawaiian Islands. I think they were the first Europeans to actually make it to Hawaii, and it was a very similar instrument to this, but the native Hawaiians really took to it and sort of made it their own. So we really think of it as a Hawaiian instrument, but it's originally from a small 4-string Portuguese instrument.
Now, you mentioned that it was made of koa wood. What difference does the wood make? Why koa versus something else? What kind of sound do you get out of these woods? And I suppose I could take your class and find out all this, right? But that would take me 15 weeks.
Well, yeah, the woods are very important, and the woods are, you want the instrument obviously to be aesthetically pleasing, so that's one thing, but as an instrument builder and as a musician, you want them to sound good. So a wood like koa, especially using the wood for the top, back, and the sides, that's very traditional in the ukulele sense. Ukuleles are very small, so the resonating body is not that large. Personally, I think I can use a lot of the varieties of woods that you're going to see here to make a ukulele, and it sound very similar. A guitar is much bigger. It has greater forces on it, so then I have to take into account the strength of various woods, etc., and not just their musical qualities. But koa and a very similar wood, mahogany, at least in density and sonic qualities, are the primary woods that you would build a ukulele with. Where on a guitar, we'll see koa and mahogany are often used for the back sides or perhaps the neck with something like spruce on the top. But I can certainly build, and I have built, ukuleles with other types of woods, including poplar, common poplar. If I have the right cut, if you can get the right cut of wood and work with it, then many woods are musical. And of course, some of the examples that I have here, we'll talk about how to process the wood properly.
Well, because you've got a couple of ukulele parts here, right?
Right, so this is a ukulele I'm building for someone. This is a slightly larger, this is a concert size, but it's the same wood, so just slightly larger. This is koa, but you can see underneath, so there's a bracing pattern here. You know, the woods, in making a musical instrument, at least a string instrument, you're balancing several things. You want the instrument to be light enough to vibrate efficiently, so the wood's got to be thin. But it has to be strong enough to withstand the tension of the strings for a number of years.
And the tension is actually quite a bit, right? There's a lot of
on a guitar, a lot more, yes. The tension's a function of the type of string and then the overall length of the string. So uke is pretty small with nylon strings. This probably has about 20 pounds between the 4 strings pulling on it, where the guitar has probably 180 pounds. So it's quite a bit different. If I had a 12-string guitar as an example, then we're talking 250 to 300 pounds. So you obviously want this to last for decades. They will outlive me, so at some point somebody can see that and wonder who this person was. And as a musician, I mean, they take a little bit of abuse. Thin woods between the dry winter we have, the humid summers. So that's where choosing the cut of wood is very important, because you want wood that's going to be stable. So inevitably, you can't just go with a thin 2 millimeter, 3 millimeter piece of wood. You have to add some kind of bracing. This is my bracing pattern for the top of a uke. It's sort of what we'll call a modified A bracing here, but it provides sufficient strength so the strings won't collapse the top. The bracing also helps to distribute the vibrations throughout the top, because you would really like the entire top to be participating in sending out the string energy.
So it affects the tone. The bracing will determine something about the tone.
Oh, absolutely. You want it strong enough, again, for strength, but light enough that it will allow it to vibrate freely.
And you mentioned that this is your bracing pattern. So would a luthier generally have his or her own bracing pattern, or are there standards that you follow?
Well, I would imagine once you've done it for a number of years, you sort of develop variants. But after hundreds of years, there are generally established
things that
seem to work. You know, trial and error of sort of evolution. And there will always be people who push the envelope, try something radically new. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. I stay probably within fairly traditional bounds, but there are subtle things that you learn to do, that maybe I'm going to try this a little differently. So it's sort of my basic personality. These instruments are fixed in over many decades, and we we sort of want that type of sound. Much of the trial and error is gone. In my current task as a luthier is to keep up the tradition and push it into slightly new directions. I'm not going to come out. There are people, then they got to try something completely different. And these things work, but I could see where I try to do things slightly. So this is a variant of some other luthiers' things for most of the backs of the instruments. And so this is both Koa top and back. It's much more useful just to have the braces run laterally across it. The back serves as a reflector.
And they're much heavier. I mean,
These will be
much
carved
larger,
down.
right.
These have to be carved down.
Okay,
yes.
I see.
These were, when I glued these on, they would have been about the
I got
height of these, and then planing. And as I'm going along, of course, I go tapping and I'm listening for, it's hard to maybe describe, but after enough experience, you know when you have a very responsive system. And so it's really, I can't do a good scientific test to show you the two of these because first they have a different bracing pattern.
Yes.
But yes, ultimately these to be carved down more, and so.
And again, by hand, so there's not, and you just have to learn when it's enough, and by trial and error, you've learned that over the years. So this is very much an art as much as it is any kind of science, correct?
Yes, and when I started to work, when I was working at Argonne, I had access to some nice equipment sort of on the side. It wasn't my main job there, but I was doing spectrum analysis of the sound, and I would carve and see what it would do, and things like that. My teacher, I sort of explained to him, show him, and Osman was very much old, very old traditional. It's just magic. I mean, it's experience, and yeah, there's plenty of science involved too. I can quantify certain things, but also I do believe there are some things that we quantify them as the builder, but it's probably almost too many parameters to really throw into a computer. So I like to think as a scientist, I try to balance out that there is a scientific basis of why they work, but there's still always going to be room for art. And the art is, of course, important for the aesthetics of the instrument as well. So this one also will have then Koa sides, which I've sort of meant. And so eventually when this gets together, there will be the sides. This will be the top for this particular uke. And then I have the neck for it, at least the blank of the neck, here. So there is 3/4 of the uke, and now it needs assembly and obviously a few other parts. So
And the neck is also Koa wood?
the neck is, this is mahogany, and there's a Koa decoration piece where the tuning machines will go. So this, it'll be, and then it takes quite a while to get a nice finish on. It's at least a good month-long process of a slow hand-applied finish, letting it dry, rub out. This is a hand-rubbed shellac, which is a natural product. Shellac is actually a secretion of a bug, believe it or not. A lot of people, of course, heard of shellac, but it's a secretion of a bug.
Now, I would have thought it was some petroleum-based paint product, but
No,
it's not.
no, shellac is a natural product. It's soluble in alcohol. It's produced by the Dolak bug, which is a bug that lives on tree sap and primarily in South Asia. And it secretes this crunchy coating we know as shellac, yes.
That probably is somehow related to the tree sap that it feeds on.
Yes,
right?
I would imagine, yes. Processed slightly in his body, and there you go. So
which may be why it works well on wood. It actually started out as wood sap.
that's a good point. It's a good point. So somebody figured out it was soluble in alcohol, and it's one of the older and more traditional finishes. It takes some good skill to apply it, but really once it's applied, it's probably the best finish you can apply because it works the thinnest, and so you need a finish to protect the wood, but you could probably imagine the thinner the finish, then the less mass you're adding to depress the wood and
so the more you hear
the vibrations, yeah. But you have to have some finish on it, to protect the wood, and it also does help to dampen certain overtones that may add a harshness to the sound.
Now, and I'm getting a little deep into baseball, inside baseball here, but I know that there are some instruments that are coated with polyurethane, particularly electric instruments. Is that something I take it you shy away from?
Yeah, the three main finishes that builders will use will be traditional hand-rubbed shellac, a sprayed-on lacquer, which was used for decades and still used by certain companies, and individual luthiers. I would say that's probably the main finish overall. And then now there's polyurethane finishes, which they're very good in many ways, but they're really difficult to apply, and only in an industrial environment. It's a two-part chemical mix, pretty toxic chemicals. They cure under UV light, and so an individual luthier doesn't usually mess with that stuff. the good parts about them are they're very durable. The bad parts are if the guitar needs repair or fixing, they're very hard to blend in back in the finish. Since this is a natural product, I can actually redissolve this off with the alcohol. And the same with lacquer, because there are finishes that the finish is part of a liquid vehicle that evaporates, leaving the finish. So if you re-put the vehicle on, they will dissolve. But a polyurethane is essentially a polymerization, and it's a new material, so it's impervious, which is, again, very tough and very good, but inevitably things get chipped and damaged, and 70 years from now, I think you're going to have some polyurethane finishes when some luthier of the time is going to be asked to do some work on them. It's going to have a very difficult time without stripping them entirely, perhaps.
Right.
And they're pretty toxic to mess with. I mean, again, an industrial environment when you can have full face masks and things.
Now, you've got guitar parts here as well. So the things that you've been talking about, I assume are true with guitars, but I see a much more complex bracing pattern here, for example, on this.
Yes. Let me start with, I guess, some of the raw wood. So an example of what I might buy. So how would I buy wood? I would have some things. Reaching over here. This is spruce. So if you could picture a tree without having to bring a log in here. So obviously like a tree that has grown straight with nice, even growth rings. And I think we've all seen how wood splits. It dries out and will split. So you try to feed a piece of wood that's going to split evenly, because you use those splits. Those are natural breaking points of the wood. And essentially, so a piece like this is cut off of a tree radially like that. It's called quarter sawing. So I have the grain perpendicular in all faces. And then the idea to match it aesthetically, and so it acts as one piece, because it's really hard to get a tree that's big enough where you can make the entire top. You go through the center of the tree, usually there's some rot in the middle. So what we do, and I'll buy wedges of wood, or I'll buy wood already cut into maybe 1/8 inch thick pieces, but you have to get it from an instrument supplier so it's properly dried and cut. It'll come something like this, a little thicker. Then with planes, I will plane it down to this thickness. So then I will join these two together and I will book match them. This has a little bit of character to it. I'll fill these in, but this is a very nice piece of 40-year-old German spruce. So then I will join those together, and then that's going to be the top of spruce. And so that's what I've done already here.
Also spruce.
Yes.
Right.
So you can see it's joined together, and it's what we call book matched. You can almost hear it's got a nice musical tone. This isn't just a piece of lumber that you might find laying on the side of the road. I mean, this is cut and made for trees. It's very, it's very nice tight grain. This is very high quality wood. And then, of course, the next step would be to cut it to the shape of the guitar. And so I'm actually working on a guitar for a client right now. It's going to be a parlor-sized guitar. So the next step, of course, is to cut to the shape of the general size. This is a small body. Now I can hear almost the musical tone.
Yeah, it's much more musical than just the bare wood, right?
Okay, but now this is, you could see that's pretty flexible. That is not going to take 180 pounds of pressure or tension for years. So it's going to need a bracing pattern applied. And then, well, I guess the next step, I have one. This is switching woods here, but another light wood, redwood. So this is a classical guitar top. So now I've joined it. I've added the sound hole and the rosette, which is not just a decoration. I think you can see, Kevin, that it's actually an inlay.
Yes.
So what it is, it's providing strong point, because by cutting the hole here, the wood will...
You've created weakness.
Weakness.
Right?
So a rosette is not just decorative, it's actually inlaid in the wood to go cross-graining from the wood. So that's the next step. And then, of course, I will have templates that I've developed for the various models. That's going to be the template for this.
That's the template of the bracing, the pattern of the bracing.
Yes, the bracing pattern for the top of this guitar, and then, of course, I've got the back bracing there. So the next step, that you can see it on both of these particular examples. So here's the top. Get a German spruce top with what we call an X bracing. Now these are as the braces I've applied them. They're much heavier than they need to be now. So I will be carving them down. And that's probably the single most important thing in making a good guitar, is
getting
carving them
correctly.
And I will be, and it'll get much more musical. You can see it's ringing very nicely now, but it's pretty stiff, and I could feel that is stiffer than it needs to be. So
there's that balance between stiffness and strength and stability. and the vibration that you need in order to get the musical tone that you want to get.
And the art involved is really every piece of wood is different. You can have, I've cut woods from the same log, but maybe this far up the log, and it's slightly different in stiffness. In a factory setting, they sort of overbuild to take advantage of it because they don't have time that an individual luthier can spend on, I'm going to carve these braces, exactly what I need for this top. That's what you should be paying for by having a luthier, at least someone who's competent, do it. So that will be the top bracing of this guitar.
Parlor guitar,
parlor
right?
size
which is the
guitar.
size of a guitar, right?
It's a relatively smaller body
Yeah.
guitar. This is one that's using koa for the top. So you can say it's a similar bracing pattern. It will have probably a little more mid-rangey sound, as you'll hear demonstrated shortly. The back of the guitar, so the back of this particular guitar, so this is going to be an all-koa guitar, very similar to the all-koa viol ukulele that I have, will be here. So that's the koa back, and you can see that bracing, which again has to be carved down.
And there's an inlay here as well, which is, I'm sure, not just decorative.
It's joining the two halves, and again, I could have them joined where you don't see the seam. It's often traditional to have a contrasting decoration. This is a back for actually the client that I was showing you earlier. I think I will keep that like that. I don't know that I necessarily need to have this is rosewood now.
Sure.
So it
And
really
looks-
depends on the
It looks
aesthetics.
great just the way it is, right?
Yeah, and it's, I mean, I've joined it very cleanly, so you know, the joint is, the seam is, there's no gaps.
Right.
It's also, you can use those to hide gaps, which a factory might do, but hopefully I'm not, hopefully I'm not
Yeah,
trying to do.
you're not trying to do that, right?
But, so the end result of this type of guitar, this, again, koa is very similar to mahogany. So the end result, hopefully, in another 5 months or so, given my schedule, I will wind up with something much like this. This is basically the same size of guitar. This is an all mahogany steel string guitar. So it has mahogany back and sides and top, neck, rosewood bridge binding, and an ebony fingerboard.
And it's a beautiful piece. Just aesthetically, it looks great. Why don't you play a little bit here?
Has a name on it. You can.
It does indeed, David Dolak.
Yes, and it's named Becky after my girlfriend from graduate school. We sort of had reconnected. She's, of course, married with a family, but she's also a college professor. So I said, I'm going to name a guitar after you. So.
It's just such a clear, wonderful tone out of that. And as people who have watched the show may or may not know, I myself play guitar. So I do have a sense for what kind of tones you can get out of various instruments. And that is a very balanced but bright tone. And even the word bright is kind of because of the balance of it. It's bright where it needs to be, and it's mellow where it needs to be.
Yes, thank you. All the mahogany guitars are known as very balanced guitars, very good recording guitars, because they're not bass heavy, you don't have a lot of feedback problems, and they're very aesthetically beautiful. I mean, it's a very nice piece of mahogany, all the way around.
So why don't we do this? We only have about 30 seconds left. Why don't you play the same tune on the classical nylon string guitar,
Okay, so
and we'll use that to take
this
us
is
out
the
of show.
rarest and most expensive wood pretty much you can build with Brazilian rosewood. That's a German screw stop, and this is a classical guitar, so nylon strings.
So keep playing, and I'm going to tell our audience, thank you for watching Public Perspective once again. I'm your host, Kevin McDermott. You can find us every Saturday night on Comcast Channel 19 or on the web at publicperspective.tv. So enjoy the music. Thank you and good night.